So we are at 12:01 and we have a lot to discuss today with everything that has been going on. So I'm going to kick us off. I'm Julie Novkov and I'm the Dean of Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy. And I am very grateful to all of you for taking a little bit of time to be here with us today to talk about developments in the city of Los Angeles and how those developments are likely to span out across the country as this situation continues to evolve. I'm thrilled to be joined by my colleagues from the Department of Political Science, Professors Justin Zimmerman and Tim Weaver. I will kick us off, but first, just a reminder of the ground rules for these events. I did want to alert everyone to the fact that we're recording this. I would ask that you let us all run through our short presentations, and then we will have some time for questions and answers at the end. If you want to ask a question, you can either use the raise hand function or you can put your question in the chat. If you would prefer to pose a question to us without having your name appear in the chat, you can direct that question to me and I will read it out to the panelists without mentioning your name. So with that background in place, I'm going to start us off. I just wanted to give a very brief overview of some of the things that are in play here as we face what is shaping up to be another summer of significant civil unrest and government responses in the United States. A reminder that the First Amendment is still the guiding principle for expressions of interest, discontent, whatever you want, with regard to the government in the United States. There is a right to express your political opinions. There is a right to assemble. These rights are not absolute, but when the government is engaging in regulation of speech, those regulations do have to be content neutral. They cannot be based on what is being said. And they are largely around things like time, place, and manner. So yes, you do have the right to assemble and petition the government, but you don't necessarily have the right to do it in a way that is going to cause significant disruption to governmental activities. And that is precisely the tension that we're seeing arise here. Traditionally, when you have vigorous First Amendment activities going on, the tension would arise between individuals expressing themselves and the state government, since it's the state government that is largely responsible for exercising its police power to maintain public order. But if you do have situations where protests are taking place against federal authority, federal policy, then you may get into a more complex space, like the one that we're facing right now, where you see some issues of federalism coming into the mix. So what I'm going to do briefly is just give you a rundown of what has been happening in LA, and then I'm going to talk about how some of the legal challenges around government responses are evolving. So things really got rolling on Friday, June 6th, when we had a crowd assemble at an apparel manufacturer in response to an ICE action. Those protesters were dispersed by federal agents. Then there was a protest that took place at the LA Federal Building, where Homeland Security agents fired pepper balls into the crowd and arrested people who were perceived to be interfering with this action, including prominent labor leader David Huerta. On Saturday, things ramped up. There were law enforcement clashes with protesters in Paramount based on a rumored raid at Home Depot. And you had protesters attacking vehicles and officers responded with tear gas. At this point, the LA County Sheriff's Department got involved and ordered dispersals and engaged in actions. But Saturday, the other big development was Trump's order of the National Guard to come into LA. So he used his power to federalize the National Guard and bring them in to protect federal officers who were conducting immigration operations. We saw further clashes evolving. At one point, the LAPD declared an unlawful assembly, which then empowered them to arrest people for violating that order. And on Sunday, things continued to ramp up with large-scale protests, and the National Guard, DHS, and ICE collaborating to clear protesters using tear gas, pepper balls, and other methods. And we had some incidents in which protesters were injured in clashes with law enforcement, and there were some Waymo taxis that got burned. The mayor declared an unlawful assembly in all of downtown LA at 9:30, and the unrest continued into Monday. At that point, there were 1,700 National Guard agents deployed, and the Marines were added to the mix from further order from President Trump. It was a largely peaceful protest during the day, but overnight, some property destruction. And then this sort of continued to simmer through the rest of the week. Notably on Thursday, the 12th, had the very visible arrest of California Senator Alex Padilla, who was attempting to engage with Kristi Noem. And then on Saturday, LA had wide participation in the No Kings March. And on Sunday, Trump announced that he was going to engage in broader immigration enforcement, focusing on cities with Democratic leadership. And then just yesterday, the curfew in LA was lifted locally after a drop in the arrests that have been taking place. So that's sort of what has happened up to this point. In terms of legal consequences, we have seen hundreds of arrests by local authorities for things like unlawful assembly, violating curfew orders, charges based on looting, vandalism, and that sort of thing. But there have also been federal charges filed against individuals who were arrested and detained by DHS and ICE. And those are obviously going through the federal system. There has also been the detention of an unknown number of immigrants. And apparently there have been some US citizens who were swept up in these actions as well. And there are currently, there's currently some concern about the conditions under which these people are being housed. So how does all of this play out when the federal government gets involved in an assembly that has become very vigorous and pushing on the boundaries of those protected freedoms that we enjoy? Ordinarily, again, law enforcement that is used to address civil unrest falls under the jurisdiction of state law and state enforcement. They are really the forces that across American history have been used to address situations where protests become very vigorous and begin to disrupt either law enforcement operations or ordinary civil activities in a locality. But we should remember that a little bit about the relationship between Congress and the president. The president is, of course, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. But historically, the use of the military for domestic law enforcement has been pretty heavily disfavored. And there is a congressional framework for the conditions under which this can happen. And before I explain that framework, just a reminder that when you have a situation where presidential authority is authorized by Congress, then that presidential authority is really at the maximum limits of what Article 2 allows. However, if you have a president who is acting against something that Congress has put forward, you have really the limits of Article 2 shrunk down to what the text says. That's a principle of constitutional interpretation that goes back to the 1950s. So basically, historically, we've had federal troops get involved in law enforcement activities under two sets of circumstances. One is when we have seen open state gubernatorial defiance of federal authority. This is the framework where we saw federal troops going in and, for instance, desegregating Little Rock High School. The other circumstance would be when you have state officials asking for the federal government to come in because they don't feel that they have the capacity to deal with a situation as it is emerging on the ground. So the two major statutes that are in play when we're dealing with these sorts of situations are first the Insurrection Act and its framework, and then the Posse Comitatus Act. So the Insurrection Act is really 5 statutes that were enacted in a time span going from 1792 to 1871. But basically, they lay out 3 distinct situations when the president can call out federal armed forces for use in law enforcement directly. First is when a state governor requests help because there's an insurrection against state governance, against its government. Second, if there is, quote, unlawful obstruction, combination, or assemblage, or rebellion against the authority of the United States, makes it impracticable to enforce the law of the United States by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. And third, to put down any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy if execution of the laws are hindered. These would be the situations in which a president would invoke the Insurrection Act to allow the use of federal troops for law enforcement. The language sounds really broad when you read it, but historically, this power has been exercised very infrequently. You just do not see presidents invoking the Insurrection Act. The most recent example that we have would be in 1992, when the governor of California requested the help of the federal government under George H.W. Bush after the Rodney King riots, which led to the deaths of 60 people. The other example that people would tend to invoke would be that 1957 use of federal troops in Little Rock to desegregate Central High School in the face of massive resistance to Brown. One note on 1957 is that at the federal level, you basically had the court and the executive branch very firmly on board with this agenda, and Congress had just passed the first gambit on civil rights with the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Also, incidentally, the mayor of Little Rock had actually sent a telegram to Eisenhower asking for federal intervention in that situation. One significant addition to the Insurrection Act is the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. Here, I would like to lodge a complaint because when I was in law school, I was told that it would never be the Posse Comitatus Act, and I was told that it would never be ultra vires. So I'm feeling like NYU owes me a refund at this point. That aside, Posse Comitatus, you've probably seen some discussion of this. How can federal troops be acting in a city without violating the Posse Comitatus Act? The Posse Comitatus Act basically prevents the use of the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and most recent addition, the Space Force, to be used, quote, to execute the laws of the United States. And there's a penalty for anyone who attempts to use the U.S. Armed Forces in this manner. However, there's a really important caveat. Posse Comitatus allows for an exception under circumstances expressly authorized by the Constitution or an act of Congress. So you can think about Posse Comitatus and the Insurrection Act working together to create a framework of very limited circumstances in which this sort of situation can take place. So what's going on in LA, and how are these statutes playing out in the background? I first just want to mention, if you want to know more about how all this works, there's a legal scholar, Steve Blodek, who has some great blog posts on this, and I would really highly recommend looking at those resources if you want to understand how all of this works. So when Trump called in the National Guard, he did not invoke the Insurrection Act. This is a really important factor. Instead, he cited a different statute, 10 U.S.C. 12406, which has three permissible circumstances for federalizing the National Guard. First is when the United States or any of its commonwealths or possessions is invaded or is in danger of invasion by a foreign nation. Second, if there is, quote, a rebellion or danger of rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States. And third, and this is the one on which he's relying, the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. However, there's a catch. This statute also states orders for these purposes shall be issued through the governors of the states. This statute is not as broad as the Insurrection Act. So troops can only support and, quote, ensure the protection and safety of federal personnel and property. So this doesn't empower them to go out and start acting like police officers. So when the National Guard was federalized, the state of California actually filed a lawsuit objecting to the federalization of the Guard on a number of different claims. And the district court that heard that case agreed that California had a point here and entered a temporary restraining order. The main objections were that the district court found that the statutory conditions were not met and that the order didn't properly go through the governor's office, and that the federalization was therefore for an unlawful purpose under posse comitatus. This TRO was immediately appealed to the Ninth Circuit, which put it on hold. They conducted oral arguments earlier this week, and we should be getting a ruling out of that court about the legality here and whether a stay is appropriate very soon, possibly tomorrow, possibly by Friday, I believe. The judges that heard the case seemed a little bit more skeptical than Judge Breyer was in the lower court. But there was a really interesting amicus brief filed by several former secretaries of the U.S. Army and Navy and some retired four-star admirals and generals in which they expressed concerns about the uses of troops for this purpose. So we'll have to watch and see how that plays out. But it is quite possible that this panel of the Ninth Circuit will say, a little bit dicey here, but not enough to say that this is actually an improper exercise of power under that statutory framework, as long as the National Guard is not directly engaging in law enforcement actions. However, as I mentioned, the Marines were also deployed. And when we're talking about the Marines, right, the president doesn't have to go through the governor to activate the U.S. Armed Forces, again, Commander-in-Chief. But when you're talking about the direct deployment of armed forces, that puts you precisely in posse comitatus. So the Marines could not be authorized to conduct any law enforcement activity. They are really limited to serving as support for federal activities that are going on in that area. There's been some interesting talk about this. There was a former Judge Advocate General who had 30 years of experience who expressed some significant unease about, well, how do you know when federal troops are actually beginning to cross that line into law enforcement, suggesting that if you have Marines who are detaining people, that could start to run them into some trouble. Another concern here is that the infantry unit of the Marines that ended up getting deployed to LA was actually not previously trained in the use of non-lethal force and crowd control. You know, the U.S. military is very quick and nimble. So they did actually put these folks through a 20-hour training package prior to deploying them. But still, that has raised some concerns in some quarters. And obviously, the discussion coming out of the administration about using troops in other circumstances does have some people concerned about where this all may be going. So I cannot, unfortunately, give you a clear answer about the legalities at this point. But the president is in a situation where if he did want to push forward onto firmer legal territory, the path to do so would be to invoke the Insurrection Act. But again, that is a move that really has been very infrequently used in US history. And for the president to use the Insurrection Act in a circumstance where you don't have state agents asking actively for that kind of help to quell an insurrection, or you don't have a situation where the entire state under the leadership of the governor is challenging the authority and policy prerogatives of the federal government, we would be in some very uncertain territory. So with that, I will conclude and hand the digital mic over to Justin.
Thanks, Julie. I learned a lot. But one of the things that I want to add on to what Professor Dean Novkov is talking about is there's I've struggled with this, struggled with understanding like when outrage exists for things like subjugation and oppression of Black and Brown communities, particularly when we think about the type of state violence that we see in places in certain areas of LA, in certain areas of Chicago where I study, in certain areas of New York, and major cities in general, and not so major cities. And one of the things that I keep coming back to in my own research and in my own studying is this concept of race class subjugated communities. It's something that was coined by Leslie Weaver and Joe Sauce. And one of the things they talk about is that what characterizes race class subjugated communities is this form of state violence that oppresses a community to the point to where they don't really have any type of political say. So they're always they're servile, they're beaten, they're killed, and all these things that characterize what a lot of Black people, a lot of brown folks, a lot of Latino folks have seen in their communities for generations. Now, the interesting thing about this new uprising of caring about what is happening with ICE, what's happening with essentially state violence in general, is that part of it is that Trump is just such a lout. He's someone that speaks so much. He's so boisterous. He's so spectacular that he brings renewed focus on things that have been happening for generations. Maybe not necessarily with regards to the purpose of you literally using the military, but for instance, they didn't. Presidents didn't really have to use the military because in 1997 they began giving their local police departments military equipment. I want you guys to think about like if you've ever been to a festival, if you've ever been to like some of these, like, especially if you have small children like me, have you ever been to these places where, they got the firefighters out, they got the police officers out, and it's like, you can ride our equipment. I want you to think about what type of equipment you see. Sure, you see the fire engine, but what else do you see from the police, right? You see that big, large tank that they ride around in the middle of some small town in New York or wherever, where, you're like, well, what do you need a tank for? You cover 20,000 people in your town, like Altamont or somewhere like that, where I saw it. Or you think about like what are some of the equipment that you used to see in Ferguson and in Baltimore, some of the more recent raids. I mean, protests and riots and stuff like that. What do you see? You see people in armed, decked out in helmets and in armor and all of these things and tear gas. And, and these are things that have been put in place for a very, very long time and have been escalating, particularly when we have these moments in history and these moments in American politics where there's a fear that marginalized communities will become violent towards the violence that is always geared towards them. So where I look at this is not so much that I want to say this carefully. What Trump is doing is out of pocket with regards to, putting the literal military into situations of protest. But the reason why it's out of pocket is because for the longest time, we used major local police departments to do this work for us. And we gave them the military equipment. They have the assault rifles. Go down to New York City. See how your police officers are dressed and stacked for what I presume they think is another terrorist attack of, assault rifles and everything else. And see if you can really distinguish them from just your local beat cops a lot of times. And you'll see that what we've been doing for decades is prompting a more militarized response to protesters, a more militarized response to community members, particularly community members that were already overly policed, already are the biggest subjects to violence, particularly folks that are undocumented. But honestly, people just look a certain way. Like the reason why you see some of this stuff of like American citizens being swept up is because we all know that immigration is wrapped up in race science and what we have perceived to be a foreigner. So they'll see someone who they think looks Latino. However, they have put that in their brain and they just sweep them up with everybody else because they don't care. And these are things that have been consistent about how we think about policing, how we think about surveillance, and how we think about profiling. Now, with that, I wanted to talk about some of the issues that I talk about in my own research, but also like how do we think about how local strategies come about with regards to state violence, regardless of whether it's the federal government or the local state government doing it. And I'll be quite honest with you guys, the funny thing about all of this is that it's really hard to really distinguish between who's really doing what in those situations because we're all working together in some capacity, no matter what the mayor or the governor is saying. So, because police lie. Yeah, that's my research opinion, but also my personal opinion. A lot of times they lie. So there's this distinction between trying to decide, well, is this the federal government working? Is this the local state government? But the quite honest truth is that communities, particularly marginalized communities, often don't have the luxury of trying to figure that out right away. So they have to spend time thinking about how they're going to defend themselves. And these strategies are come long before Trump is president. To give you an example, one of the first strategies that I noticed, even as a Southern California myself, is like how do you talk to your children about how they're supposed to interact with the police, how they're supposed to interact with law enforcement. And that's not just something that you hear, and like in 2020, it was kind of like a sob song of violence. It's like, oh my God, I didn't know black kids had to deal with this. But no, it's more organized than that. It's a way of understanding how you're supposed to go about interacting with what you know is going to be a certain amount of racial violence. And this is something that predates the things that my parents were doing in the 1960s. If you think about the Highlander School, training activists to know how you're going to interact, not only with, like local races, but how you're going to interact with the state, how they're going to react to you. So and part of what that's doing is of giving you some instances of knowing your rights. So that doesn't start with ICE in 2025. That starts long, long before that when you start thinking about the civil rights movement starting to push through. And even beyond that, how are you going to interact with these state, local officials, federal officials, and their hostility towards you as a person, as because of your race, because of how they have perceived you to be? And that includes putting together pamphlets, the same things that I still see in Chicago. Know your rights pamphlets. You don't have to talk to them. Don't open your door. Stuff like that. Or even talking to you about how we're going to protest, how we're going to make sure that we can keep track of who is where, because we want to make sure that if people get injured, if people are put in prison, that we can give them the type of resources that they need in order to push back, in order to basically not be stuck in whatever oppressive state that the state has them in at that moment. And that also means at times local strategies don't look the way that Americans that may not be used to what's happening in marginalized communities may want it to look. So there's a lot being said about, well, how are people reacting to what is either the federal government or the local state governments when they're being attacked? Are they being violent? Are they not? But what I want some of this to come back to is like, are they defending themselves or are they not? How have they been pushed against? How are they being? Who is throwing the tear gas first? All of those things are coming. Like if someone takes, and I want you to think about this because we're most of us in this room are in a privileged class, right? But if someone just literally takes your wife, takes your daughter, takes whoever, and they have no defining characteristics of where you can figure that out, and that's not just ICE, that's local police departments too. How are you going to respond? Like, you're not going to just let them be taken away. So, I want us to think a lot more about what that means with regards to what we allow both the federal government to do, but what we allow local government to do. The one thing I've been trying to push, mostly through social media, but I think it's going to end up in my book too, is that it's not just that ICE is the people that's not identifying themselves. That ICE is the people that are committing all these state violences and all these instances of state violence against people of color. It's also the local PD doing it, and they've been doing it for generations. First thing that came when I was in Inglewood, Chicago. The first thing I saw, my first interview, is that there was some cop, what I assume was a cop. Again, he wasn't marked, with an assault rifle, a brown beanie, and a brown shirt, and, and a bulletproof vest, hovering around one of the predominantly black elementary schools at the time, and that was in 20. I've been doing this for a while, 2019. So, there are, we have to understand that part of what we're pushing, what we need to be pushing up against, if you care about making sure that you have a president that doesn't go full king and, no kings, blah, 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 is that you also have to be thinking about the nature of policing and the nature of who they're policing and the nature of how they are criminalizing people and how they determine who's a criminal and who's not. Like, oh no, I think that was just the email. But there was something about, how did people characterize mass deportation? And one of the things is that, well, we just want to get rid of criminals. But who dictates who's a criminal? And all of these play into how Trump is deciding how he's going to justify what he's doing to California, what he's going to probably end up doing in Chicago, what he's going to end up doing in New York City. So, I think that in talking about this conversation and talking about the role of federalism and talking about the role in the military, we also just have to talk about, well, what's the nature of how we're going about law enforcement? And maybe those radicals in 2020 weren't wrong when they were like, we might need to be defunding and abolishing. Turning over to Tim.
Thanks very much, Justin, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Um, uh, I think that, Justin, your comments that helped to historicize what's going on were very helpful. And I think that it's often helpful to think about Trump and the Trump presidency and the moment we're in as a symptom rather than a cause of something that's been going on for a very long time. Thinking in particular about this idea of the imperial presidency and what happens when the imperial presidency comes home. And one of the things that happens when the imperial presidency comes home is the militarization of law enforcement at the local, state, and federal levels, and the use of those instruments on the American people. And we're certainly seeing that now, and that accretion of power at the federal, at the executive level has been something which has been going on for a long time, partly because Congress has been giving additional powers to the presidency, and partly because it's just refused to play its anticipated constitutional role. And we've seen now the chickens, I think, are very much coming home to roost in that respect. One thing I think that's particularly worth noting about this latest round of deportations, again, is that it's not necessarily a new thing. And this is, lots of people from the Biden administration were at various times quite keen to point out, especially before the election, a bit less so after it, that they had been deporting millions of people too, and using ICE officers to do so. And the same, of course, goes for the Obama administration. so that's very important to bear all this in mind, because I think one of the things that I wanted to talk about in my remarks today is this idea of a crisis, because it feels like we're in a crisis. Indeed, since I think we agreed to have this panel, we've had the arrest of Senator Padilla, the arrest of the New York City controller and mayoral candidate Brad Lander. We've had the military parade on Trump's birthday, the No Kings protest, and the possible US involvement of a war between Iran and Israel. And that's just in the last few days. And that's, of course, just the headline crises, right? And beneath which there are all sorts of legion others. But it does, I think, raise the question about whether this is a crisis in the sense that we're at a turning point where something has to give, or something a little bit perhaps even more troubling. And that is that we're likely, I think, to remain in this in a sort of unsettled, stable state of crisis, or rather of constitutional incompetence or impotence, because the Constitution is not working as envisaged. On the judicial side, because the strategy of the executive, I think, is to break the law frequently and with impunity, it's simply not possible for the judicial branch to keep up. And so, and clearly that's part of the strategy. If you eliminate an entire federal agency, even if you know it's probably not going to stand up in court, if those people have now had to get other jobs, well, you've done the job that you were hoping to do. And so we see this again and again, particularly let's think about what's happening with universities, cutting research support, what's happening with vaccines, and so on and so forth. And so the challenge then on the judicial side is to try and keep up. The challenge on the congressional side is that Congress doesn't seem to be particularly interested in holding the executive to account. We do see, of course, examples of hearings where there seem to be some, at least decent probing of government officials. But certainly, since the president appears to be committing impeachable offences at quite a clip, doesn't seem to do what the founders imagined, which is that presidents would anticipate that they could be impeached and so therefore were restrained in their behavior, knowing this was a possibility. It seems now that either Trump knows this is not a possibility or would relish the opportunity to have a third impeachment trial. The other thing, of course, is the way that this trickles down, the president's use of the pardon power means that the federal agents engaged in various likely illegal activities are acting at least partly on the basis that they might reasonably expect a pardon for illegal actions that they take. And certainly that's what Trump has encouraged people to understand. I mean, if you remember his rallies, he would say things like, if you beat up the protester, I'll pay your legal fees, and that was probably the thin end of the wedge. If you imagine now what ICE agents expect in terms of support from the executive for various actions they're taking, I think that they can probably feel relatively safe. And so where does this leave us? Well, the Legion assaults on the constitutional order by an unrestrained imperial executive seem forbidding. But it turns out that the American people, who, as Churchill said, America always does the right thing, but only after exhausting all of the plausible alternatives, seem to be taking action. And what we actually see, according to the crowd counting consortium, is that there are actually about 3 times as many protests in this year than there were in 2017. There's some estimate that the number of people that showed up over the weekend at the No Kings protests were in the region of 4 or even 5 million people. And so therefore what we're seeing is that even while the formal institutions of the constitutional system seem either unwilling or unable to provide a check on the executive, that the people are trying, and in some cases raising pressure on the administration, and presumably will provide the basis for organized forms of resistance and electoral consequences for what's going on, assuming that we have elections next year. I think that what we are seeing is the nascent construction of quite a broad and deep coalition, which is acting in opposition to what's going on. The question of whether it materializes on election day, whether it remains engaged and mobilized, is going to be the big question and the big challenge for the survival of the democratic system in this country. Because clearly the imperial presidency will roll out its powers as far as possible to impede such resistance, and will use various pretexts, legal or otherwise, to do so. So that's what I'm particularly interested in looking out for, the extent to which this nascent movement solidifies, whether or not it continues to attract more people out onto the streets, and what the administration does to try and counter that. And so those are the things that I'm thinking about at the moment. Thanks very much.
Terrific. So we do have a few questions already. Srinja asks if there are legal precedents for situations where the state and federal governments disagree. The closest analogy we have to that would be the conflicts over enforcement of desegregation in the 1950s. Again, in that circumstance, you had massive resistance by state governments to a unified federal mandate that schools be desegregated. And in that situation, all 3 branches of government agreed that it was appropriate for the federal government to exercise its authority to enforce the law. So you'll likely see some discussion about the extent to which this situation is like that one, or fundamentally unlike that one, since we don't have, all 3 branches of the federal government on the same page, nor do we have at this point direct resistance to the federal government by state authorities. I just want to clarify, the Ninth Circuit has had oral arguments, but they have not yet ruled. There were some questions raised at the oral argument about whether it was appropriate for the courts to intervene in this situation, or whether they would have to defer to the president as commander-in-chief. The one thing I'm very confident in predicting is that whichever way this case goes at the Ninth Circuit, it's not going to end there. There will be an appeal. It will probably first go to a full panel review by the Ninth Circuit, and then the loser will take it up to the Supreme Court and attempt to engage them as well. Just a quick ad. If you want to talk about the Supreme Court, we will be putting together a lunch and learn in July to talk about the 2024 term and all of the excitement that entails. We have another question submitted anonymously on the subject of disinformation, misinformation. Where are folks receiving trusted forms of intel and information? This commenter keeps reading things that seem to conflict with one another, which makes it hard to have civil discourse with people who may not see eye to eye, as information can be so vastly different depending on the source. So, Tim and Justin, where do you go?
Well, I tend to use a variety of different sources for my news, including sources that aren't based in the US. So I do read the New York Times. I do read The Guardian is another, I think, useful source. And then for things like uh, 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 polling information or public opinion information, I do like to use some of the accounts on Substack. So, for example, Elliot Morris has a good one. And I'll just post that because he's just done something on the protests and the turnout of the protests, which is quite handy. Nate Silver's got his sources as well. And I mean, I like to listen to NPR. So I guess I'm a classic liberal in that respect.
And me, to be honest with you, it's really tough right now because even Nate Silver, my eye went because of the way he talks about black people and black political behavior. But but what I use is like a lot of you all. I use some of the classic New York Times. Sometimes I'll look through Atlantic articles just to see what they're talking about. Sometimes I'll look through NPR. Sometimes I'll just look through CBS because they seem to have, well, depending on the time of day, they seem to just have like a straight, like, this is what's happening in the world, and that's it. And I appreciate that because you're kind of surrounded by punditry right now. So it's really, really hard to get. I mean, part of this is kind of how I think about academia too. It's like, yeah, to an extent, it's objective, but also we all are putting in a certain amount of prejudices of what we think we're seeing. So it's very hard. But probably the other only thing that I think to use, particularly because when I think about how reporting is done in marginalized communities, particularly what you're seeing in East LA, what you'll see in places in New York City, like the Bronx, where you'll see in how people describe Inglewood and places like that. It's like sometimes it also helps, as these two know, to use social media and to talk to people who are actually there to see the videos of what they see, to see how they are interpreting it. It may not be classical journalism, but they are a whole lot closer to what their communities are and what they're going through than anybody else. And that's especially important because they don't necessarily have the same vested interest that we see in some of the more major news outlets. But that's not satisfying, right? Because everybody wants objectivity right now. But right now, that's incredibly difficult to find without looking through a lot of sources, which a lot of people just don't have time to do. That's an unsatisfying answer, but yes.
I would agree as well. I think it is very difficult in this information environment to find good, reliable sources for information. If you want kind of a general picture, I think you can still look to those old school media outlets. I do agree that it can be very useful to look at international perspectives to get a fix on what's going on in the United States. I've become interested in the Financial Times. I think they do a good job often. But Washington Post, New York Times, all of that, you can get some good stuff out of that. But I think Justin raises a really important point, which is that if you really want to know what's happening in a specific space, you want to see if you can find people who really know that space. And that can be either a geographic space or a policy space. If I want to know what's going on in Philly, I read the Philadelphia Inquirer. They're fantastic. There are a lot of local media outlets in New York City that really have a good fix on what's going on the ground at a very detailed level. If you want to know about immigration stuff, the mainstream media is not always the best place to look because immigration law is very complicated. And there's a whole history going back to plenary power of Congress, and the authority that immigration officials have is often something that people don't necessarily recognize. So I tend to follow immigration experts when I'm trying to figure out what's going on in that space. Aaron Reiflin-Melnick is a great source on immigration law and policy. If you're looking for stuff on voting, I tend to turn to Steve Vladek first, because again, he's been researching and working on those kinds of questions for many years. And there are also terrific specific sources that I tend to turn to when I have questions to make sure that I'm on the right page. But yeah, it is a real challenge. And you kind of have to know enough to be able to find where those good resources are and be able to distinguish between somebody who's just yapping on Substack and somebody who has a Substack that is really informed by their deep knowledge and expertise of the space that they're talking about. So, yeah. Other questions that people have? Oh, who for voting? Sorry. I'll type his name in the chat. He has a great, he has a couple of things going. There's the election law blog, which is a group blog on elections. But he also has his own blog where he talks about legal issues more generally. And yep, Ashley Fox also has a great point about remembering that media always has particular framings that are aimed at audiences. So it can be very helpful to make sure that you're looking at questions through multiple frames. If California wins the case, what would be the outcome and the next steps for the federal government? You could have a ruling that comes out of the Ninth Circuit. Right now, again, remember that when you are in the early stages of lawsuits, courts are entering rulings that are not intended to be permanent. So if they want to stop everything that's happening on the ground really quickly while they figure it out, that mechanism is a temporary restraining order, which can then convert into a more long-term pause in legal action in the form of a permanent injunction if a court is convinced on a deeper factual argument that the legalities point in a certain direction. So were California to get a permanent injunction against the Trump administration returning National Guard control to the state of California, I would presume that the Trump administration would appeal. And they would ask the Supreme Court to stay that injunction and wait for a full appeal under a petition for certiorari, and then full argument and decision. We are seeing some hints from the Supreme Court that they are not particularly eager to launch right into a head-to-head challenge with the Trump administration. So they have tended to lift permanent injunctions or pause permanent injunctions. And they've even figured out some mechanisms to intervene in temporary restraining orders, which is not a thing that higher courts usually do. But at some point, the court will have to confront the direct legal questions that are coming up in these cases once they do reach a final decision that they have to address. So yes, we do have to watch the extent to which mainstream media outlets are engaging with Trump and at times taking actions that seem designed to stay in Trump's good graces. That is definitely a factor in play here. Other questions from the audience? So we did have a few questions that came in before the event. Just a question about what local leadership can or should be doing in these sorts of situations. Any thoughts on that from our two experts who have done much more with local politics than I have?
Well, I think local leadership is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Well, depending on what you mean by local leadership. If you're talking about Mayor Karen Bass, but but I want you all to expand how you might be thinking of local leadership because really what local leadership is, it's those grassroots organizations and also just individual community members and how they interact with their neighbors and think to essentially at times defend their neighborhoods from what they see as some form of oppression. And what I think they're doing is completely right. First of all, they're being quite vocal in places like East LA and places like all these places aren't in LA, by the way. But places like Paramount, California, where they're vocally stating that they are going to defend their community members, that they are going to defend their neighborhoods, that they are going to say that what is happening is not right. And even in like more like nowadays we have like these almost like feel good stories about that time that they let the I think there was a person that was from I forget the Middle Eastern country, but they had been like a local small business owner, and I think they were like baking cakes or something like that. And ICE obviously took them, and the community got together and got them out at least for a little while. Those type of things are already happening and they're already very effective in showing that, look, these are not mandates because the big thing Trump is trying to do is say, this is a mandate because I got elected. Like they want us to remove all these people. And what neighbors and local officials are saying is like, no, we see value in the immigrant population that's in our community. We don't want it to be overly policed. We don't want the federal government to essentially use our places to abuse and use undocumented immigrants. So those things are already happening. And one of the things that's happening that frustrated ICE when they first started this is that people are being very clear again and letting folks know what their rights are. No, you do not have to open the door for ICE all the time. No, if they don't have a warrant, you don't have to speak to them. We can teach you how to use your rights. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, because as we all know, ICE and local police officers don't always value what people's rights are. But it's a start in order to get some type of pushback, and that you're starting to see that education all over the nation on how to deal with this, including in Albany. So I think that's where you're going to see it. Now, from a mayor perspective, I think that there's starting to be some talk of that. I think Governor Hochul, which is a little bit more state than local, but is putting together that $50 million package to defend undocumented immigrants that are detained by ICE. Those are starts with regards to like political action, political figures. But what you're already seeing in neighborhoods, particularly those that are characterized by their immigrant populations, is that resistance and that protection and that hiding of their community members. And that's very, very important. And it's something that we've always seen, particularly during the abolitionist movements in that 1800s and stuff, that when you think about the Underground Railroad, nothing quite that extensive yet, but still that protection of marginalized communities and marginalized neighbors is happening. So they need to continue doing that.
The other thing I'd just say is that it's certainly worth watching the footage of Brad Lander in New York City encountering our ICE agent in an immigration court, where he's trying to shepherd somebody whose case had been dismissed from that court out of the courtroom without getting snatched up by ICE agents, and was requesting, I think, illustrating some of the tactics that Justin just mentioned, that they present a warrant. And I think he was saying that they needed a judicial warrant, and there's some question about whether they needed an administrative rather than a judicial warrant. But in either case, agents who are ununiformed, don't have a uniform, are hiding their faces, are required to produce some sort of a warrant or issue some sort of charges, and just snatching people is not consistent with what's required by the law. And so working out how to respond when people encounter that seems to me very important to work out.
Well, we are at time. I just feel that I want to underline that one great place to go for factual information is right here to Lunch and Learn at Rockefeller College, where we will not only give you information, but we will try to unpack things for you and do our best to answer your questions. So thank you all for spending some time with us this afternoon. We will continue to provide these events going forward in the future. And we very, very much appreciate your interest and your engagement in these very important issues. And I'm very grateful to my two colleagues for taking the time to be here with us today.